The third morning after the funeral, the great library at Ashcombe Hall was still hung in black crepe, and Margaret Weir was on her knees at the base of the north bookcase with a dustcloth in her raw hands, while 11 people in mourning silks discussed, above her head, the disposal of an estate she had kept warm for 9 years. She had been told to clean during the reading. Not after. During. Lady Corvin had judged that a housekeeper working quietly in the corner would remind the assembled gentlemen that Ashcombe was a house of order, and that order, in this season of grief, was worth a great deal of money. So Margaret polished the oak while the solicitor read, and she did not look up, and she heard every word the estate, entailed away from the late Earl's daughters, passed to a cousin nobody in the room had met before Tuesday. Mr. Rufus Bandry stood near the fire in a coat too new for the occasion, and accepted the news with the mild surprise of a man who had rehearsed it. The daughters were provided a portion. The widow was provided the dower house. The servants were provided a quarter's wages, and the recommendation of the new master, should he choose to give one. And the housekeeper, Lady Corvin said, in the voice she used for weather and for people, may be kept on, I suppose. She is a fixture. One does not throw out the fire irons merely because the house has changed hands. A fixture. The word went into Margaret at the exact spot beneath her breastbone where such words had been going for 9 years. And it found the old channel, and it ran down it easily. She did not stop polishing. That was the thing about a body trained to service. It kept its rhythm even while the person inside it was being described as furniture. At the far end of the room, in the deep window bay where the winter light came in gray and flat off the park, a man she had not been introduced to had gone entirely still. Margaret felt the stillness before she understood it. She had spent 9 years reading rooms the way a sailor reads water. Somebody had stopped moving, and stopped moving in a way that had weight, and her hand slowed on the oak without her permission. She glanced up, with thence. He was tall, and he was not looking at the solicitor. He was looking at her, and he had heard the word fixture, and something in the set of his jaw had gone hard as a stone under a plow. He looked away at once. It cost him something to look away. She saw that it cost him, and she immediately told herself she had imagined it, because she was 31 years old and a housekeeper, and the light in that bay was poor. She learned his name an hour later from a footman named Peter Coley, who had been at Ashcombe since he was 12, and who told Margaret everything he heard, because she had once sat up 3 nights with him when he had the quinsy. He was Adrian, the Earl of Rail, and he had come down from Northumberland for the funeral because the late Earl had once done him a kindness he had never repaid. They say he does not speak, Coley said, arranging the black crepe on the hall glass with his tongue between his teeth. Not at dinner, not anywhere. Lady Corvin has put him at the far end, and he has stayed there. Then he is a sensible man, Margaret said, and took the crepe out of Coley's hands and hung it properly, because it had been hanging crooked for 3 days, and the mourning of a house is a thing you do correctly, or not at all. The mourning had a schedule. Margaret had written it. 9 years of running Ashcombe had taught her that grief in a great house is a species of housekeeping. The glasses were turned. The clocks were stopped at 11 minutes past 4, which was the hour the Earl had died, and Margaret had stopped every one of them herself with her own hands, because she would not let a maid do it. The looking-glass in the long gallery was covered. The knocker was muffled in black cloth. 41 candles had been consumed in the 2 nights the coffin lay in the hall, and Margaret had counted them, because she counted everything, and because counting was the only form her grief was permitted to take. What Margaret did not yet know was that the oak she had been polishing had a hollow in it, and that the hollow had been cut by a man who was already dead, and that within a fortnight the whole architecture of Ashcombe would rest on the thing sleeping inside it. Stay with her a while. The house is cold and the fires are laid, and she does not know yet what she is standing on. Margaret Weir had come to Ashcombe Hall at 22 with a dead father, a Latin grammar, and no character reference worth the paper. Her father had been a country curé with more books than sense, and he had taught her Greek because he had no son to teach it to, and he had died owing £42 to a wine merchant in Salisbury, who was not disposed to be gentle about it. The books went first, then the furniture, then the house that had never been theirs, and Margaret at 22 had stood in a lane in October with a trunk and an education that was, in her circumstances, closer to a deformity than an advantage. An educated woman in service is a problem. She reads the labels, she corrects the accounts. She knows, when the master quotes Horace at dinner, that he has quoted it wrong, and she must school her face so that nobody sees her know it. The late Earl of Ashcombe had known. That was the strange part, the part she had never told anyone. He had found her in his library at 6 in the morning, in her second week, reading his Thucydides with a candle stub. And instead of dismissing her, he had sat down in the chair opposite and asked her what she made of the Million dialogue. She had told him. Honestly, he had laughed until he had to take off his spectacles. For 9 years after that, he had left her books. Never, openly. A volume set out on the reading table with a bookmark at a page he wanted her opinion on. A note in the margin, in his crabbed hand, addressed to nobody. She would find it at dawn, read it, leave her answer penciled underneath, and by evening the book would be gone and another would be there. Nobody in that house had ever known. Not his wife, who was dead. Not his daughters, who were kind and blind. Not Lady Corvin, his sister, who had come to run Ashcombe after the Countess died, and who had told Margaret, in her first week, that the mark of a good upper servant was a total absence of personality. The Earl had never once said Margaret's given name. He had called her Mrs. Weir, as one calls a housekeeper, and he had left Thucydides on the table, and that had been the whole of their friendship for 9 years, and when they carried him out of the house in November, she had not been permitted to attend the burial because the servants' hall was needed for the funeral meets. She had polished the library instead, all of it, every rail, every rung, every inch of the north bookcase where he had liked to stand. The morning after the reading, Margaret rose at 4:30 and went down to the library, because the fires wanted laying, and because she could not sleep in a house that had been given to Mr. Rufus Bandry. The new master had already made changes. The Thucydides was gone from the reading table. In its place lay a folded sheet of Bandry's accounts, and a decanter, and a glass with a ring dried into the wood beneath it, and Margaret stood looking at that ring for longer than a rational woman would. She fetched beeswax and a cloth, and she knelt at the north bookcase to work the ring out of the oak. The panel moved under her hand. It was the third panel from the floor, the one she had polished 4,000 times, and it moved half an inch to the left with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and Margaret went cold from her scalp to her heels. She did not open it at once. She knelt there with her hand flat on the oak, and her heart going hard enough that she could hear it in her throat. And she listened to the house. The kitchen was not yet awake. The clock in the hall gave the quarter. Then she slid the panel back. The hollow was the length of her forearm, and lined with green baize, and it held a single sheet of paper, folded in 3, sealed with a blob of red wax that had been pressed with the flat of a thumb rather than a signet, as though the man sealing it had not wanted his ring on it. Her name was on the outside. Not Mrs. Weir. Her name, Margaret. She sat back on her heels in the cold and looked at 9 letters in a dead man's hand, and understood that for 9 years he had known it and never once used it, and that he had saved it for this. She broke the wax. The paper held 11 lines, and the 11 lines took Ashcombe Hall apart. The late Earl had married, at 19, in Scotland, a woman named Eleanor, the daughter of a naval surgeon. The marriage had been irregular and entirely legal. His father had ended it with money and a threat and a lie, and Eleanor Rush had gone to Halifax with a son in her arms, and the Earl had spent 40 years being told that both of them had died on the crossing. 2 years ago, a letter had reached him from Nova Scotia. The son was alive. He was a shipwright, 41 years old, with a wife and a trade and no notion whatever that he was the legitimate heir to an English earldom. The note named him Thomas Rush of Halifax, It named the parish in Dumfriesshire, where the register lay. It named the solicitor in Edinburgh, who held the extract. And in the last line, in handwriting that had begun to come apart, the Earl had written that he had lacked the courage to say it aloud while he lived, and that he was leaving it where the only person in the house who read anything would find it, and that he was sorry. Margaret knelt on the library floor in the dark with the paper in her hands and the whole cruel machinery of the thing assembling itself around her. She could burn it. Nobody would ever know. Bandry would have Ashcombe. The daughters would have their portions. And she would have a place. She could take it to Lady Corvin, who would burn it and thank her and keep her on. Or she could carry a piece of paper to a solicitor and tell 11 people in mourning silks that the housekeeper had been reading the master's correspondence and be turned out of the only door she had, at 31, with no character. She folded the note. She put it in the pocket beneath her apron, against her ribs, where she would feel it every hour of every day. Then she laid the fire, because the fire wanted laying. Lord Rail had not gone north. He should have. The funeral was done, the will was read, the courtesies were discharged. Instead, he stayed at Ashcombe on Bandry's grudging invitation, and he took the small study at the end of the east corridor, and he was in the library at 7 every morning when Margaret came through with the coal. He never spoke first. He would be standing at the window bay with his hands behind his back, and she would come in with a scuttle and he would say nothing at all, and she would lay the fire and go. On the 4th morning he said, "You are cold." Margaret's hands were split at the knuckles from the November water, and she had a shawl that had been good in the year she came. She said, "The room will warm directly, my lord." That is not what I said. He crossed the room. He did not look at her. He took the shawl from the back of the chair where the late Earl had left it years ago and had never reclaimed, and he put it on the table beside her, and he went back to the window and put his hands behind his back again and looked out at the frozen park. "Take it," he said. "It has been on that chair for 4 years. Nobody wants it." The words were flat as a plank. There was no kindness in them at all, arranged as they were, and Margaret felt her face go warm anyway and hated it, and picked up the shawl because the alternative was standing there arguing with an earl about wool. "Thank you, my lord." "Do not thank me for a chair," he said. She got out. In the corridor she stood for a moment with the shawl over her arm and her heart doing something absurd, and she told herself, with the practiced efficiency of 9 years, that the Earl of Rail was a cold man who disliked waste, and that she had constructed the rest. The house had decided long ago what Margaret was. She heard it again, on the Sunday, in the passage outside the still-room, from Miss Selina Corvin, who was Lady Corvin's niece, by marriage, and who had been installed at Ashcombe within a week of the funeral with 3 trunks and a great deal of confidence. Selina was 23, and beautiful in the way that a well-made thing is beautiful, and she had been raised on the certainty that she would be a countess, and Bandry's arrival had rearranged her plans very fast and very quietly. "That woman," Selina said to her aunt, unaware or unconcerned that the still-room door was open, "reads the newspapers. I saw her. A servant with opinions is a fixture that has come loose from the wall." "She is a fixture," Lady Corvin said. "Fixtures do not have opinions, they only appear to." Margaret stood in the still room with a jar of preserved damsons in her hands, and did not move until they had gone down the passage. Then she put the jar on the shelf, and turned it so the label faced out, because it was her still room. And the labels faced out, the note against her ribs, made a small stiff shape under her apron all day. Selina Corvin had a project, and by the 2nd week of December it was visible from every window. Mr. Bandry was to be secured. He was 51 and widowed, and possessed of an earldom he did not understand, and Selina was to become the next Countess of Ashcombe by the simple expedient of being the only agreeable woman in a house full of grieving ones. Lady Corvin arranged it as she arranged the flowers with a firm hand and an eye to the light. The obstacle was Rail. He would not leave. He sat at Bandry's table and said almost nothing. And his silence was doing something to Bandry's confidence that Bandry could not name, and Lady Corvin, who had spent 60 years reading rooms, understood perfectly well that the Earl of Rail was not staying at Ashcombe for the shooting. She simply misidentified the reason. She assumed it was Selina. On the 12th of December, Margaret took a candle up to the nursery corridor at 9 at night because she had heard a child crying, and the nurse had gone to her sister's lying in. The child was Alice Bandry, who was 7, and who had been brought to a house where her father was suddenly an earl, and nobody had explained any of it to her. She was sitting on the floor of a cold room, she did not know, with a wooden horse in her lap, and a fever coming on. And she was crying in the way children cry, when they have already learned that crying does not fetch anyone. Margaret sat down on the floor beside her. She did not fetch the nurse, who was gone. She did not fetch Lady Corvin, who would have said the child was overtired. She sat on the boards in her housekeeper's black, with her candle set on the floor between them. And she asked Alice about the horse. The horse was called Belle. Belle had come from Southwark. Belle did not like the country, and Belle did not like this house. And Belle wanted to go home. And none of these opinions obviously belonged to a piece of carved beech, 4 inches long. Alice explained all of it in the wrecked voice of a child with a throat full of fever, and Margaret listened as though it were the Melian dialogue. Then she went down 2 floors to a kitchen banked for the night, and she woke nobody, and she heated milk herself in a small pan over the embers, with honey in it and a scrape of nutmeg. And she filled a warming pan from the range, and carried the whole lot back up 3 flights of stairs at 9:30 at night, on legs that had been going since 4:30 in the morning. She got the child into the bed. She put the warming pan in at the foot of it and took it out again after 4 minutes, because a warming pan left in a bed makes a child sweat, and a sweating child takes cold. And Margaret had known that since she was 19 and nursing a curate through a Salisbury winter. Then she sat on the boards beside the bed with her candle on the floor, and she told Alice Bandry the entire history of the wooden horse-bill. Belle had been carved in Southwark by a man with 1 eye. Belle had crossed the river 11 times. Belle had once been left behind at an inn, and had walked home. It went on for the better part of an hour, and Margaret invented every word of it out of nothing at all, in the voice she had used on Peter Coley when he had the quinsy. And somewhere in the business of Belle walking home from the inn, the child stopped shivering and went to sleep with her hands shut around the horse's neck. She did not know that the door was open. Lord Rail stood in the corridor outside for the better part of half an hour. And he did not come in, and he did not announce himself. He listened to a woman. The house called a fixture invent a life for a piece of carved wood so that a frightened child would sleep. At the end of it he walked away very quietly, and in the east corridor he stopped and put his hand flat against the wall as though the wall had moved. Margaret never knew he had been there. That is the shape of the whole thing, and there is no help for it. She was carrying a piece of paper against her ribs that would cost her everything, and she thought she was entirely alone in the house, and she was not, and nobody told her. The wound in Adrian, Earl of Rail, had a date on it. He had been 26. He had been engaged in the proper way to a woman named Harriet Neve, whose family had wanted the match a great deal more than she had. Harriet had told him, on a terrace in June, that she loved someone else, a man with no money and no name, and had asked him what she should do. He had told her to honor her engagement. He had been correct. Every man he consulted told him he was correct. She had honored it, and she had married him, and she had lived in his house in Northumberland for 4 years, being unfailingly pleasant, and she had died of a fever at 30, with his name, and not 1 hour of her own life. He had not loved her, and she had not loved him, and he had held the whole machine in place with both hands, because holding machines in place was what he had been raised to do, and she had died inside it. He had never said this to anyone. It had gone into him and stayed and made him the sort of man who stood in window bays and did not speak. What he had done since was watch for the machine. He had a horror of it. He heard it in rooms. He had heard it 3 days after the funeral of a man who had been kind to him once, when a woman on her knees at a bookcase was called a fixture by people who genuinely believed it, and he had gone, still in a window bay, and he had understood with an immediacy that frightened him that he was in the presence of the same machinery that had killed his wife, running smoothly, and that this time he was not going to hold it in place. He carried the late Earl's kindness in the form of a debt. Now he had somewhere to pay it. It took her 4 days, and it cost her every coin she had, and she did it on the pretext of a sister's illness that Lady Corvin granted, with visible irritation in the observation that housekeepers with relations were an inconvenience. She travelled outside on the mail because inside cost 11 shillings more than she had, and she arrived in Edinburgh in the last week of a hard December with her hands gone the colour of skimmed milk and her gown smelling of horse. She went to the address in the note. It was a narrow door on a close off the high street with a brass plate worn down to a smear, and she sat in Mr. Cully, Hanley's outer room in her one good gown for 5 hours, while 3 gentlemen who had come after her were shown in before her, and a clerk of about 19 looked at her twice and decided, both times, that she was somebody's servant come to complain about a legacy of £4. At 2 o'clock she asked him in Latin whether the appointment book was arranged by precedence or by hour. The clerk went the colour of a boiled ham, and fetched Mr. Hanley. When Hanley finally saw her, she put the note on his desk, and she said plainly what she was, and how she had found it and what she believed it meant. She did not apologize for being a housekeeper. She had spent 5 hours in that chair deciding that she would not, and it was the single hardest thing she did in the whole business, harder than the hall, harder than Lady Corvin, because there is no arena crueler than a room where you are simply not important enough to be refused. Hanley read it twice. Then he went to a press, and came back with a japanned box, and out of the box came an extract from the parish register of Kirkbride, dated the 4th of May in the year 1785, recording the marriage of the man who would become the Earl of Ashcombe to Eleanor Rush, spinster of that parish. He had held it for 2 years. The Earl had written to him, and paid him, and then had lost his nerve and written again to say the matter was to wait. He wanted it done, Hanley said, and he could not do it. Men are like that with their fathers. He looked at Margaret over his spectacles for a long moment. You understand what you are carrying? This unmakes the will. The cousin is nothing. The daughters keep their portions and lose their standing. Lady Corvin loses her house. And you, madam, will be the servant who did it. Yes, Margaret said, you will not be forgiven. No, she said. I do not expect to be. She came back to Ashcombe on the 20th of December, with a certified copy in her bag and the original note against her ribs, and she went to work at 4 the next morning, as though nothing had happened because the fires wanted laying. Bandry had made his own arrangement, quietly. In the meantime, he had been to the Earl's papers, and he had found in the late Earl's desk a second letter from Halifax, unopened, and he had put it in the fire and watched it burn. He was not a wicked man. He was a man of 51, who had been poor for 51 years, and who had been given a house. And he had reasoned, in the way such men reasoned, that a letter he had not read could not oblige him. He had checked the desk twice more since. He had never once thought about the bookcase, because Bandry had never in his life gone looking for anything in a book. On the 23rd of December, Lady Corvin gave the ball. It was held in the state ballroom at Ashcombe under 300 candles, out of mourning, by exactly the margin propriety allowed, and it was in the strictest sense a business transaction. Selina was to be presented to the county on Bandry's arm, and the county was to understand that Ashcombe had a mistress again, and the whole thing was to be settled before 12th night. Margaret worked it, housekeepers do. The ballroom she had opened at 7 that morning, with 2 maids and a bunch of keys, and by 8 in the evening it did not belong to her at all. 300 candles and 4 chandeliers, and the sconces down both walls, and every one of them counted, trimmed, and set by her hand. 62 dozen hothouse roses forced in the succession houses at a cost she had entered in the book at £9 4 shillings, an orchestra of 11 at the north end. The terrace doors standing open a hand's breadth despite the cold, because Lady Corvin held that a warm ballroom was a vulgar ballroom. The marble balustrade above the floor, polished at 4 that morning by a girl of 15 named Susan Pike, who had cried doing it because her hands had split, and whom Margaret had sent to the kitchen with a jar of goose grease and no lecture. She stood at the service door for 6 hours, with a list. She sent the ices in at 11, exactly, and the negus at past. And she watched Selina cross the floor in ice-blue silk with the Ashcombe diamonds at her throat, diamonds that had belonged to a woman now buried in the church, diamonds that Margaret had taken out of the strong room herself that afternoon. That was the arithmetic of it. And Margaret did it, standing up in black, at a door. Every beautiful thing in that room had passed through her hands first. Not one person dancing under those candles could have told you her given name. At 11:30, Lady Corvin found her at the service door. She did not raise her voice. Lady Corvin had never raised her voice in her life, she said, in the pleasant tone she used for weather, Mr. Heir. Bandry tells me a woman, answering your description, was seen in Edinburgh, in a solicitor's office. The candles went on burning. The orchestra went on playing. I was visiting my sister. My lady. You have no sister, Lady Corvin said. I have your character from the year 89. You have nobody at all. She adjusted her fan a half-inch. Whatever you imagine you have found, Mrs. Heir, put it in the fire tonight. You are a fixture. A fixture that meddles in a family's business is not corrected. It is removed, and it is not spoken of again, and no house in this county takes it in. Then she turned back to her ballroom, and her hand did not shake, because in 60 years it never had. Margaret stood at the service door with 300 candles burning in front of her, and understood that she had been seen, and that she had until morning. She went upstairs at midnight, and burned nothing. At 6 the next morning, on Christmas Eve, Bandry sent for her to the library. He had Lady Corvin at his shoulder, and Selina at the window, and a pen in his hand, and he was not enjoying himself. The pen had no ink on it. He turned it over twice while he spoke, and never once wrote anything, and Margaret watched him do it, and understood that he had been given his lines and did not like them in his mouth. He told her that her services were no longer required. He told her that in the circumstances a character could not be given. He told her she might have until noon to remove her belongings, and that the quarter's wages would be paid, and that this was more than she deserved. Behind him, the fire she had laid at 4:30 that morning was burning well. Because she had laid it well, because she had never in 9 years laid a bad fire in that grate. 9 years, Margaret said. 9 years of employment, Lady Corvin said, is not a claim. It is a wage. Selina at the window did not turn around. She had the decency, or perhaps only the discomfort, not to watch. Margaret stood on the carpet in front of the north bookcase in the room she had polished for 9 years, and heard herself dismissed by a man who had burned a letter. She said, "May I speak, sir?" "You may not," said Lady Corvin. Margaret looked at her. 9 years of a body trained to service, and it held, and it kept its rhythm. And she said the sentence she could not have said in any of those 9 years. "He knew my name." She said he never once used it. He was afraid too. Nobody in the room understood her. It was not for them. She went upstairs and packed a trunk that took 11 minutes to fill, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the room she had slept in for 9 years, with the certified copy in her bag and the note against her ribs. And for the first time since her father died, Margaret put her face in her raw hands. Then she got up, she washed her face in cold water. She put on her one good gown, and she went down to the great hall at noon on Christmas Eve, where the household was assembled for the new master's address, because Bandry had decided that a formal beginning would settle the servants. The whole house was there, every maid, every footman, the cook, the grooms. Lady Corvin at Bandry's right, Selina at his left in blue. And in the doorway, unannounced, having come down from the east corridor without a word to anyone, the Earl of Rail. Margaret walked out into the middle of the floor with her bag in her hand. "Mrs. Antor." "Heir," Bandry said. "You have been dismissed." "Yes, sir," she said. "I have not been silenced." The hall went absolutely quiet. She took out the certified extract and she read it aloud. The parish, the date, the 2 names. Her voice was not loud, and it did not break, and she did not embellish a single word, because the thing did not need embellishment. A man had married a woman in Scotland in the year 1785, and there was a son, and the son was alive in Halifax, and his name was Thomas Rush, and every soul in that hall could do the arithmetic. Bandry said, "That is a forgery. It is certified by Mr. Hanley of Edinburgh." Margaret said, "He has held it 2 years. Your cousin paid him for it and lost his nerve." "There is a second letter from Halifax in the desk, sir. You will remember it." Bandry's face did something that answered the question. Lady Corvin came forward. She was very calm. She said to the hall, rather than to Margaret, that the woman was dismissed for theft, that she had been in the master's papers, that nothing she said carried any weight whatsoever, and that she would be off the property within the hour. "She is a housekeeper," Lady Corvin said. "She is a fixture. Who in this room will take her word against mine?" The Earl of Rail crossed the hall in 3 strides. He did not raise his voice either. He stopped beside Margaret, close enough that his shoulder was at her shoulder, and he turned and faced the room, and the room turned with him because he was the only man in it. With nothing to gain, he said, "I will. I have asked her to marry me." He had not. He had not asked her anything. He had said it in front of 11 servants, and a magistrate's wife, and the woman in ice-blue silk, and by saying it, he had made it a thing that existed, and the cost of it landed on him, and he stood there and paid it. The silence went on for 4 full seconds. Then Selina made a small sound, and her fan came down, and something crossed her face that was not fury. It was recognition. She had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and she had just watched a man decline to make the correct choice, and she understood in that instant that she had never once been chosen either. Lady Corvin's hand moved to her throat. She said, "You cannot." She said it again. "You cannot. You cannot possibly." The polish was gone out of her voice, and what was underneath was an old woman who had run a house for 60 years on the strength of everybody agreeing with her, and who had just met the one man who would not. Hanley's clerk arrived at 2 o'clock, having traveled down behind Margaret by 2 days. With the sealed extract and the Earl's own instruction, the magistrate came at 4. The thing was procedural after that, and procedure is slow, and none of it was triumphant. The shipwright in Halifax was written to that week by Hanley, in language so careful it took 4 sheets to say a thing that could be said in 1. He came in the spring. He was a broad man of 41, with a shipwright's hands, and a Nova Scotian voice, and no idea whatever what to say to any of them, and he stood in the great hall at Ashcombe on an afternoon in April, looking up at a ceiling his father had been born under. And the first thing he said to the assembled household was that the roof timbers were oak and badly scarfed at the 3rd joint, and would want looking at within 10 years. The servants adored him within a fortnight. He was very kind to his half-sisters, who were kind and blind and who had never in their lives been unkind to anyone, and who cried when he arrived, and then could not stop asking him about ships. He kept Lady Corvin's dower house on her, which nobody had required him to do, and which several people advised him against. When Margaret asked him why, on the one occasion they spoke of it, he said that his mother had died in a rented room in Halifax, at 61, and that he had discovered he had no appetite at all for turning old women out of houses. Bandry went back to Southwark before 12th night. He wrote, later, 1 letter of apology to Margaret, and never any to anyone else, which was the truest thing he ever did. The daughters kept their portions. Selina married a man in Bath the following year, and was by all accounts less unhappy than she had expected to be. Nobody was destroyed. That is not how the world corrects itself. It simply stops agreeing with you, 1 room at a time. Adrian did ask her, properly and afterwards and alone, which mattered more to Margaret than the hall had. It was in the library at 7 in the morning, with the fire she had laid burning in the grate. He stood at the window bay with his hands behind his back, and he did not look at her. And he said that he had said a thing in front of 40 people that he had no right to say. and that he would carry the consequence of it alone if she wished, and that she owed him nothing, and that he had never in his life wanted anything the way he wanted her to say yes. Margaret crossed the room. She stopped a foot short of him. She could hear her own heart in her throat. He turned, and neither of them moved, and the space between them was 6 inches of cold library air, and 40 years of two people being told what they were, and his hand came up and stopped hovering at the level of her jaw, not touching. "Margaret," he said. It was the first time in her life that anyone had said it out loud. She closed the 6 inches herself. They married in April at Kirkbride, in the parish where a naval surgeon's daughter had married a frightened boy of 19 in the year 1785, and the register that had unmade one house made another, and Margaret signed her name in a clear, educated hand under the eyes of a Scottish minister. Rail in Northumberland was a cold grey house that had not been warm in 12 years. She warmed it, not sentimentally. She had it inventoried and relaid, and the chimneys swept for the first time since Harriet. And the housekeeper she engaged was a woman of 40, with a Latin grammar and no character reference, which Adrian noticed and did not remark upon. Alice wrote to her from Southwark twice a year in an improving hand, and the wooden horse called Belle came to Northumberland on a visit in the summer, and was much admired. On the first night of December, a year after, Margaret sat in the library at Rail with snow coming down past the window, and the fire going, and her husband asleep in the chair opposite with a book on his chest, and she took the note out of the box where she kept it. She had never had it framed. It was a folded sheet of paper with red wax on it, pressed with the flat of a thumb. She read the 11 lines again, and the last one, and she thought about a man who had spent 9 years leaving Thucydides on a table because he could not manage to say a single word out loud, and who had cut a hollow in his own bookcase and put her name on the outside because it was the only brave thing left in him. She had forgiven him a long time ago. She had never told anyone that either. She folded it in 3 along the old creases and put it back in the box, and she looked at the snow, and the fire moved, and Adrian slept on, and the house was warm all the way to the top floor. He had known her name the whole time. She lived in a house now where it was the only thing anybody called her.